Please allow me to present Dr. Corina Lacatus, our speaker today. Dr. Corina Lacatus is Assistant Professor of Global Governance in the School of Politics and International Relations at the Queen Mary University of London. She is also Senior Visiting Fellow with the Phelan's US Center at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Before she joined Queen Mary University of London in September 2021, she was the inaugural Hillary Clinton Fellow at Queen's University Belfast between 2020 and 2021, and a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh between 2017 and 2020. Dr. Lacatus holds a PhD in International Relations from London School of Economics and a second PhD in Germanic Languages and Literatures from the University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA. Together with Heather Johnson, she is the co-founder and co-director of the research network Voices in Mobilities and Migration, which encourages and facilitates constructive dialogue amongst researchers across disciplines working on all aspects of migration. Her research is at the intersection of international relations and comparative politics, but also engages actively with political communication scholarship. She's a scholar of international cooperation and global governance, focusing on the influence that international organizations like the United Nations and the European Union have on domestic institutions, politics, and societies. So far, her research has explored these dynamics in different areas of policymaking and practice: crisis management, south to north and south to south migration, human rights, peace agreements and human rights after conflict, foreign policy of the European Union and the United States, and corruption control. In addition, she has developed a research agenda in political communication focusing on the formation and strategic uses of electoral rhetoric to advance populist political agendas. She has carried out analysis of large bodies of social media data, Twitter-based, and other internet-based data, blogs, press releases, rally speeches, and video material. Her second book, The Strength of Our Commitments, which is currently under review for publication, investigates the strength and effectiveness of national human rights institutions in Europe and beyond. Her first book, The Invisibility Complex, was published in 2008 by Stockholm University and explores questions of identity and artistic representations of the migrant experience in Sweden. Please allow me to welcome Dr. Corina Lacatus in our midst and thank her for generously offering the talk today. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liovescu, for the generous introduction. Thank you also very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the organizers for putting the event together. Thank you, Christy, for all your help. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will share my screen with you, and I just want to make sure everybody sees it, and then I will just begin my talk, basically. Let's see, are you able to see it? Yeah? Yes. Okay, able to see me while I'm talking as well. Okay, that's good, which is not important, not essential. But, I wanted to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon or evening even in Romania. I'm actually here as well and visiting family, and it's a pleasure to be here and to share my research with you. If anything, I'm hoping that it will provide some welcome break from the very distressing news we're having. Otherwise, it's we were chatting just before we went live that I'm not sure necessarily remembering Trump is a sort of good memory, but it provides you know, a sort of a distraction from the much more distressing news we have these days, but the war. So in the interest of time, I'll get started with a presentation. I'm happy to take questions at the end, and also hopefully we'll have a bit of a discussion then. I'll give you a little bit of a sort of a brief overview of what the talk is about today. I'll begin with introducing what populism is. It's obviously going to be a very brief introduction because it's a scholarship that's quite vast, and it's a very scholars of populism today are very prolific, particularly since 2016. Then I'll speak very briefly about populism on social media, so the use of social media by populist politicians. Then I'll introduce our research project. It's a co-authored research project. I'll tell you much more about the sort of more technical parts of it, then I'll present our findings. I'll discuss the case of Donald Trump's electoral communication during the first months of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I'll reflect a bit on the broader relevance of the research. And then we'll move to Q&A. All right, great. So we've been hearing since 2016, particularly since the successful election of Donald Trump and since the Brexit vote, quite a bit about populism. Populism has just sort of become kind of a household name. The media are kind of repeating this word and using this label. Politicians are using it as well, not necessarily about themselves as much as to sort of describe other sometimes newcomers on, or oftentimes actually newcomers on the political scene. And this label of populism comes up particularly often during elections. And, you know, on a day-to-day basis, we sort of think, we read, especially in the mass media, we read questions like, or we sort of grapple with questions like, will the ultimate right-wing populist, right, politician, just aka Trump, return to power, right? What is he actually doing on his own media, social media networks? Is would the Romanian party a populist party? Would it be fair to kind of label it as such? Could we really speak of populism in Russia? There's quite a bit of work on this topic. Not something I engage with right now, but this one of the questions that comes up, particularly when it comes to Putin's politics. Are new waves of refugees fueling voters' support for far-right populism of the likes of Marine Le Pen, for instance? So this is particularly prevalent and important or salient, rather, in Europe, in a European context. Despite being commonly used as a term, it is rarely very clear what we actually mean when we use the word populist. It's not necessarily clear in the mass media. We don't define necessarily populism when we use it in day-to-day conversation. So I thought I would offer a bit of an introduction, obviously a very brief one today, just so we have a kind of a foundational, a shared foundation for the discussion of more kind of technical published research. At its core, populism is a type of discourse or rhetoric. It's been described as a discursive frame, and a discourse which basically means that it is a discourse that can be used by politicians across the political spectrum. So it can be on the left side of the political spectrum and on the right. Usually centrists don't use populist rhetoric, but left or right, even far left, or radical left and far right, tend to take quite well to populist discourse and rhetoric. And what it basically means is the strategic use of language and images to present a political agenda and position. Obviously, all politicians do that at an election, right? They use language and images strategically to promote a certain image of themselves and to advance a political agenda. There's something about populism, though, that makes it specifically populist, right? So a candidate, an electoral candidate, using certain types of language and images that could fairly be described as populist. So continuing to elaborate on the concept, populism can be seen as something that's been called a thin-centered ideology. So basically it means that it's not a thick ideology. So it's not on the political spectrum of ideology or left or right, right? Left or right or center, right? Or left of center, right of center, some of the all the descriptors that we use for political parties. Rather, it's not consistent, right? It's a type of language and a discourse. If it's an ideology, it's very thin, right? It's not one of the traditional mainstream ones. And it attaches itself to populist parties on the left or the right of the political spectrum. What it does, though, it puts at its center, and this is sort of the core of what populist discourse is about, an antagonism, a duality, so an opposition between what they call the people, whose voices they represent, right? And they speak on behalf of the people, and they represent their interests, versus the elites. And here the elites can be, usually the elites are negative, not usually, always the elites are self-serving and corrupt. So they're portrayed in a very negative light. If you're looking at the left side of the political spectrum, so left-wing populists usually think of the elite as the 1%, right? So the very wealthy, so in economic terms. While on the right side of the political spectrum, usually the elites are more sort of, it depends, right, which country context you're referring to. For the most part, can be anti-scientific. They can be sort of the other in terms of immigrants. They can be minorities, and we can talk about what exactly it means in an American context when we look at Trump in just a little bit. As far as populists are concerned, the people are always right, even if the people aren't necessarily or isn't necessarily well defined as a concept, right? Just to give you a couple of quick examples, a recent party that was established in December 2017 in Italy actually illustrates perfectly what it means for a political discourse to attach itself to a left-wing party. So Italy's Power to the People, Potere al Popolo, is a coalition of political parties that sit or identify as sort of being on the left side of the political spectrum. So left-wing, they're anti-liberal, anti-capitalist. They also have sort of communists, socialists, environmentalists, feminists, secular pacifists, and secular people pacifists and libertarians in their midst. So it's kind of a catch-all sort of populism, right? As long as they represent the voice of the people and they have something that they're kind of positioning themselves against, which is right the economic dimension of the elites, which would be the liberals and the capitalists, then they sort of easily kind of can be defined. In this particular case, that would be sort of represent a typical case of a populist party. And they believe in creating real democracy through popular participation. Another example, still in Italy, which I think is interesting to look at because it operates in a different way, even though it's in the same political context, national context. You have something that's called Italy's 5-star movement, and something that's been described as populism without thick ideology, another type of catch-all populism, but of a different kind, actually. So it doesn't really sit well anywhere on the ideological spectrum. It was in coalition with a right-wing party, La Liga, right, for a while, and then only sort of a short while thereafter joined a coalition with a center-left Democratic Party. So it's a typical kind of thin ideology, right, that sort of catches on, even if it's the same party, can catch on to a particular thick left ideology or right ideology as it suits it, sort of its agenda. It runs on a strong anti-immigration agenda, which is usually identified with sort of with right-wing populism. It's Eurosceptic, which kind of echoes a little bit what is happening in Europe and sort of Hungary and Poland. It also, though, runs on something that oftentimes is identified with the left wing. So it's cutting national debt, it's guaranteeing basic income and minimum pension, and also a flat tax. So these are two examples of how very different kind of parties can actually be defined as populist, which also becomes sort of proves the point or illustrates the point that it's really important to define what we mean by populism, because it can mean so many different things, right? And not really be defined properly in terms of given the diversity of parties and leaders that can be labeled as such. Okay, just a very quick note. There's lots that we can talk about if you're wondering the Q&A about the use of social media, but basically the internet, particularly Twitter, has helped with the dissemination of populist communication and ideas. It's been the sort of breeding ground of right-wing populists around the world, actually, and sort of mobilization as well. And in recent years, social media have become a more reliable source of mainstream media as well. So oftentimes we see tweets being cited in the news, right, as sort of reliable source. So it's becoming sort of more of an obvious place to go and do research about communications and about strategic communication, strategic use of language for electoral purposes. We can talk about this during the Q&A as well, why it's particularly well suited for populist communication style. Populists have been described as kind of more direct, and sometimes they use an irreverent communication style, so they can be kind of sometimes a bit rude and definitely much more personable as politicians and their style of communication, at least. And for those particular purposes, Twitter is very well suited as a medium of communication. It's sort of immediate, quick, short messages that can be delivered to somebody's mobile or sort of desktop instantaneously, but also they can feel much more kind of personable and can make the electorate connect to the leader much more easily. And to move it to the research project that I promised that looks at Donald Trump in particular, I'd like to introduce it very briefly. It's a co-authored project that has been it was published in 2021 in September, so a few months ago, and it's co-authored with Dr. Gustav Mebar, who's a colleague from Radboud University. It illustrates my continued interest in political communications and the use of Twitter in particular for strategic communication. And it was a real challenge, if I can sort of introduce a personal note on it, to both academically and personally, to research COVID and Trump's discourse in the spring of 2020, if nothing else, because the pandemic was very new for everybody. We're trying to make sense of what was happening. Governments were also making sense. We're trying to make sense of what was happening in international organizations as well, how to sort of best respond to the pandemic and manage it. And as you'll see in a bit when I'm talking about Trump's communication in particular, it was rather confusing to sort of read and code tweets. So I spent a lot of time reading Trump's tweets and coding them. And I found that emotionally challenging, but I thought it was worth it for research. I hope you'll agree. Okay, so what is our research about? A lot of research in political science and international relations, particularly comparative politics, has looked at how and why populists have come to power in recent years, particularly since 2016. It's just been a flourishing area of research. What we don't know nearly as much about is what makes possible for populists to stay in power. So once a populist leader is in power, what can they do to win re-election? So incumbents like Trump, when they run for re-election, as he did in the beginning of, throughout actually 2020, most of 2020 and the year prior, and particularly through the first half year of the pandemic, how did he manage everything with the intention of staying in power and running as he was running for re-election? More specifically, in our research, we wonder how populists use language in their strategic electoral communication. So we're not looking at policy agendas, we're not looking at policy programs. Some would argue that there isn't much to sort of write about when it comes to Trump's policy positions overall. He's right, as Trumpism is mostly talk, is what a lot of academics say. You know, some might agree or might disagree, especially when it comes to foreign policy. However, we're focusing on the use of language for strategic electoral communication because we're mostly interested in populism as a type of discourse. So the research question is that we're focusing on and we're seeking to address is how do incumbents running for re-election convince voters to support them for a second election? Whether or not they're victorious in the second election is irrelevant. Is what are the strategies that they're using in their language. We're looking at the case of Donald Trump and his communication strategy to manage early COVID response during his electoral campaign. And I think probably at the time there was no need for sort of a justification of the case selection, right? Why Trump of all leaders? He was taking up a lot of media space, a lot of sort of headspace as well. I think he was present everywhere, and his communication was particularly influential, I think, when it comes to the COVID crisis, but also because the election was going on at the same time. He was also one of the most prolific Twitter users of all time. That's in the past tense, as his account you all know has been closed by Twitter, but it was sort of an obvious place to go to research-wise to research, and I had worked on his communication previously. So basically, you know, to illustrate that, as the quote says, he was very proud of the fact that he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and he would still not lose voters. So I just wanted to see to what extent and how did that actually look in communication when it comes to in a situation of crisis, right, of extreme public health and global health crisis. So just a couple of more definitions, and then we move away from concepts and more in the example. So what is crisis when it is real or perceived is central to populist rhetoric across the political spectrum. And crisis, just so we kind of all have a shared understanding, has three main components. It's a question of a threat or perception of threat to key values, institutions, and everyday life. In this case, COVID, right, completely changed our everyday life. There's also a sense of urgency in a crisis to do something, to react, to respond, and actually longer term to manage it, right, quickly against this perceived threat. And crisis is also bringing with it a pervasive, so a sort of large scale uncertainty about how things will evolve and how they should be handled, short term, medium term, and long term. So the COVID-19 pandemic fits the definition perfectly. In a crisis, people expect their leaders, political leaders, to provide an authoritative account of what is going on, to explain why something is happening, and what is being done about it, right? So they have a responsibility to actually explain the policies that they're taking and the strategies that they're taking to tackle it. Standard crisis rhetoric, so when we're looking at the communication side of it, is actually incredibly important in a crisis context. And usually, because it's almost half of the sort of half of the response is rhetoric, how we present it to the public, and half of, or the other half, if you please, is the policy, the actual actions. Standard crisis rhetoric consists of precision about the crisis, its impact and policies. It also requires cooperation across actors and political parties. So leaders would encourage that, right, in public discourse about a crisis and responding to it. More often than not, we rely on science to justify crisis response policies. That's pretty standard. We also expect leaders to use empathy in communication with the public in a large scale crises, right, to show that they're sort of there with a sort of a population. And also they produce, usually in their communication, they try to communicate to create a rally around the flag effect, right? So to all bring together as a nation, sort of nationalist kind of sort of message that would bring everybody together in fighting this or resisting it or kind of combating and responding to the crisis. Our main argument is, as I mentioned earlier, just to remind you quickly, what about politicians in power running for re-election, right? So what we're saying is incumbents, so populists in power, and politicians in general actually who are already in power and they're running for re-election. Because they're already in power, they must lead the crisis response process. For this, they have to use standard crisis rhetoric, which I mentioned just earlier, has sort of a few main characteristics. As electoral candidates, they face a real challenge if their political platform does not align with standard crisis communication. So this basically means that if the political agenda that they try to promote in their election campaign to, you know, hopefully secure re-election clashes with the type of rhetoric and you would expect in a crisis response, then you end up with an electoral candidate that's in a moment of crisis, that has an electoral crisis, right? So it faces a dilemma and a choice, right? To what extent does it actually kind of go more into the standard crisis rhetoric, and to what extent does he or she or they stay kind of closer or more in line with their own political platform that initially secure them an election, right? In this case, in 2016, Trump used a particular type of rhetoric, and I'll go into that in a second. So just to bring this kind of home to you in terms of Trump's case. So if standard crisis rhetoric focuses on precision, cooperation, science, empathy, and a rally around the flag effect, Trump's right-wing populism was dominated in 2016 and still was in early 2020 when COVID-19 pandemic began by an anti-elitist discourse, right? That's not surprising. That's what populists do. But elites also included scientists, right? So it was an anti-science position. He was being exceptionalist and exclusionary in his rhetorical use. So right, he was talking about sort of migrants bringing COVID. He was also talking about the US being sort of exceptionally unaffected by COVID in the beginning, right? You remember a lot of that sort of discourse that was sort of exceptionalist, American exceptionalism, and sort of feeding and fueling nationalist discourse as well. And he is also aggressive in his criticism of political assumptions. And I'll detail that in a second and the findings. Just a quick sort of more technical note for those of you who might be interested in the volume of tweets that I've and press briefings that I've had to read. So we collected the data from beginning of March to beginning of May 2020. So it's the very beginning of the COVID pandemic, actually before it was declared officially a pandemic. I used NVivo, which is a qualitative content analysis computer software, and I identified 279 different themes or nodes, if you've ever used that software, in press briefings issued by the White House, and also 264 themes on Twitter. I looked at the unit of analysis for press briefings were paragraphs. I looked at 245 paragraphs that I coded, and not surprisingly, even though there are fewer themes, so content-wise, they're sort of less rich. There are far more tweets, right? 582 tweets. Yeah, so I basically, and I looked at the real Donald Trump account. So as you can imagine, coding that much text by Trump took its toll in the first months of the pandemic. Good, our main findings. Trump's main challenge in the first weeks and months of the COVID-19 pandemic as a crisis was that as president, Trump had a responsibility to lead on crisis management. In a large-scale public health crisis, he could really only rely on the advice of public health specialists and to be able to propose response policies that were adequate, but also to communicate in a reliable way and trustworthy way with the public about the pandemic and the government's response. But the COVID, the sort of crisis of his own, electoral crisis of his own that he faced, was the fact that the COVID-19 crisis and the government's crisis management response did not easily match Trump's tried and tested right-wing populism. So the kind of discourse that he had used in 2016 and also in support of candidates for the midterm elections 2 years post 2016, so in 2018, November 2018. So he was faced with this dilemma to lead the country during COVID-19 response convincingly in a standard kind of way, and to also at the same time, and balance that with his own electoral campaign. What we find is the pandemic's impact fueled public demand for competent leadership, which is not surprising, and crisis response policies, exerting pressure on the administration. At the same time, under this pressure, Trump oscillated during those first 3 months between consistency and his well-known tried and tested rhetoric that would be familiar to his voters, while trying at the same time to project personal competence. Trump advanced policy based on medical experts, as we know, right? Dr. Fauci, he became the kind of sacrificial lamb in the end to his administration, but he was sort of relied on a lot in the beginning. In the same breath, though, what Trump did is he made recommendations appealing to his anti-science and anti-elite base. And here, I don't want to spend too much time on the graphs, but I'm happy to take questions during the Q&A. But what I want you to look at is just briefly on the left side of the screen. Is it left for you as well? Yeah, everybody left. You have the clusters of themes that are identified in the Twitter account, and then on the right you have the White House press briefings. And just very briefly, the aggregates code. So there are lots of them. Sort of as you disaggregate them, I have a couple of slides at the end if you want to look more in depth. I can take questions during the Q&A as well. But if you look looking, what's interesting is there's some differences and similarities, and they're both equally interesting. He does a lot of campaigning and sort of very concerned with presidential image overall in terms of the themes on Twitter, and that's not really surprising, given that it was his sort of personal Twitter account that he was using even as a president. But then when you look at the White House press briefings, you would expect them to only be about COVID-19 or primarily about COVID-19, then about rally around the flag, which is nationalism, right? And what he also uses the official White House press briefings for is to run his campaign, and also to berate, to criticize heavily the mass media, the mainstream mass media, which he thought were sort of were treating him unfairly. So I think that's interesting to sort of see. We can talk more about it later, but what I want to also illustrate is the fact that he uses Twitter. So if we go back for a second here, see that the second kind of largest bar here is actually illustrating the fact that he was talking about COVID-19 and the crisis on his Twitter account as well. But the way he did it was to actually go against and contradict his own messages from the press briefings, largely. That's basically kind of what he did. So the tension in communication and the contradictions in communications were very interesting. And his communication were very interesting, looking at the two platforms and types of data. Just to give you a quick example, in light of these studies, he tweeted on the 3rd of April, 2020, in light of these studies, the CDC, which is the Center for Disease and Control and Prevention, is advising the use of non-medical cloth face coverings as an additional voluntary public health measure. So it's voluntary. You don't have to do it. They suggested for a period of time, but this is voluntary. I don't think I'm going to be doing it. So that gives you an idea of how he was sort of saying what he was supposed to say to do standard crisis management, but then also advancing his own kind of electoral agenda. Just to reflect on the findings really quickly, and then I'll end. So by April 2020, basically Trump's rhetoric was back to electoral business as usual. So he almost pretty much abandoned standard crisis rhetoric and standard sort of crisis response, and he just decided to run his election, to put it bluntly. He returned to anti-science and anti-elite rhetoric. He continued to be concerned about creating a positive view of himself and of his administration's crisis management, as he viewed, most likely deliberately, at least in his communication, as his communication shows, that he was no longer concerned with the scientific basis of that crisis response. He blames the failures in the pandemic management on state-level governance and administration to just sort of deflect responsibility. And the US was portrayed in this communication as unique in the world in pandemic management, thanks to him and his administration. And he continues in both press releases and meant for the mass media dissemination, right, which is sort of paradoxical, to attack mainstream media for lying about him. He continues to do that consistently in Twitter as well. So I'm happy to take questions about these in the interest of time, because I want to take questions. I won't go over in detail over those two graphs, but I'm happy to discuss them if you would like. It's just disaggregated codes, basically. Why does all of this matter? To understand that right-wing populist incumbents will go to great lengths to maintain power. That's basically what it means, even if that means not running a crisis response policy or crisis management strategy that will save the people from sort of imminent death in a pandemic, right? They sort of, somebody like him, like Trump, would prioritize actually his electoral campaign. Not even large-scale public health crisis could hold them back, would hold him back in this particular case, possibly more broadly the case in other countries and around the world as well. When their ideological position and strategic rhetoric contradict standard crisis communication, the candidates will prioritize campaign rhetoric over crisis response. And this is a pun that's intended. The promise of continued electoral gains trump scientific evidence and facts. And I'm going to end here because I want to take questions as well. Thank you very much for listening. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Cora, for this extremely intriguing talk, which explains to us some of the things we're actually experiencing here or today. And please feel free to ask questions of the speaker, either directly or place them in the chat box. We already have some remarks and probably a question. Let me read it for you so we're all on the same page. We have Christian saying, I cannot ignore the fact that these facts presented today are very well present in the reality we are living today. More exactly, the Ukrainian-Russian war crisis. In this case, what is your own opinion regarding the perceived online success of the Ukrainian leaders and the image they have created using populism on social media and other media?
Thank you very much for the question. It's fascinating. Actually, I think I hadn't even thought of that in terms of Zelensky. I think I was so focused on sort of trying to make sense in a rational way, which is basically impossible, of what Putin's strategy might be. But yeah, I think you're really, you're making a very valid point that what he's using is what Zelensky's using is a communication strategy on social media that very much is sort of in line with what populists would do. Now, what's interesting is that he's not, I think, so the rally around the flag effect that populists rely on and they use as a rhetorical strategy, something that comes from war times, right? And it's something that has sort of been conceptualized in social sciences as well, and in political science by specialists in security and military security in particular. So what he's doing is just that, right? Trying to mobilize via social media, mobilize via Telegram in particular, and Twitter. And he's actually gone a bit beyond just being the voice of the Ukrainian people and kind of speaking for now the whole West, whole Western world, and trying to kind of, and representing the West and fighting and responding to Putin. So I think it's legitimate to sort of think of him, at least during wartime, as a populist leader. Now, he doesn't obviously promote an ideology at the moment because he's responding to a crisis, and military crisis on top of it. So it wouldn't be fair to analyze them in terms of sort of a thick, what we call in social science, a thick ideology, right, on the left or right of the political spectrum. I know that prior to the war, he was sort of kind of more left-wing, more kind of EU focused and European in his approach. And or actually I wouldn't say left wing, I think more progressive is the right way to describe him, sorry. And I haven't looked at his communication prior to the war, but I think is a very interesting research project right there for somebody who sort of also read Ukrainian. So thank you, it's a fascinating question. I think he's turned much more populist at a global level. I think it's a unique kind of character right now, I think.
If we also think about the platform, the campaigning platform of his, very much advocating against corruption. Supposedly, this is one of the reasons he was elected.
Right.
So that's one thing
that makes sense
to consider. So any other questions? Please feel free to ask our speaker anything about the main points that she made during the talk. I'm sure we all have rich thoughts about, the correspondences, in our own political spectrum. So was COVID-19, another question we have here from Marinella Sorina Vodova, was COVID-19 the biggest crisis so far? What is your opinion about it?
Wow, would it be fair to say on a personal level, so not a scientific way, analysis of it, but more a personal level, that I hope it's the biggest that we'll ever have to live through? But I might end up eating my own words later on, but because I'm afraid perhaps what we're going through at the moment it's definitely, in terms of the human toll it's taken on a daily basis, at the very least comparable. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. In terms of populist rhetoric, I think COVID-19 has definitely shaped a lot of sort of public opinion about populists, and populists have sort of used a lot of the crisis to divert kind of rights away from people. So if you're looking at different kind of, if we're looking at Boris Johnson, for instance, and the way he sort of managed the crisis and how he's used that to promote some policies that actually take some liberal rights away from the British population, right? So we can talk, we can talk at length about that, but I'm hoping it's the last biggest, or the biggest crisis that we'll ever have to live through.
Thank you. And now we have another question from Andrei Lukic, our professor, who is an expert in mathematical modeling. So a more specialized question this time. He says this is a very interesting talk, and he thanks you for sharing. He has two questions. I'm not sure if I mentioned this or you mentioned this, but did you try to run a topic model or a clustering algorithm on the tweets? And if you did, can you share the results? And the second question is, given that the discourse seems to change over time, I'm curious if you noticed a tipping point in the rhetoric. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the more technical questions. I've used topic models and clustering, but not in this project. So this project, the way that I analyze the data, it's actually qualitative content analysis, so not quantitative. Partly because it was just sort of for ease of access to and the sort of research assistance that could help with the coding for intercoder reliability. So I used NVivo, which is a qualitative tool for analysis of content, and I would love to share the results. But I don't have the sort of more than I don't have sort of topical topic models to share with you, I'm afraid. I do have the word list. So I didn't use a dictionary, I use a word list, and I'm sure you would know what I mean by that. Okay, so moving on to the less technical stuff, a tipping point, yes. So data is collected over time, and I don't remember the exact date right now, but it was towards the end of March, beginning of April, that his rhetoric just basically went from, I'm no longer calling this a pandemic. I don't even really know if this is a pandemic anymore. I'm not sure that, we care about any of the sort of WHO recommendations anymore, or really Dr. Fauci's recommendations. He still kind of managed to keep respecting him for a little while longer, and then kind of just sort of isolated him as well. So that's the beginning when that's the sort of tipping point when he moves straight into standard electoral rhetoric that his electorate would recognize as sort of familiar and trustworthy. And as you sort of, I'm sure, remember, he ended up getting the most votes of any Republican candidate ever. So even though he lost the election to Joe Biden, he still ended up having more support amongst right-wing Republican voters than any other candidate. So clearly his rhetoric was scaringly successful, despite not being sort of focused on managing the crisis effectively. Thank you.
Thank you too, Cora. Now, the next question comes from Miruna Albu, and it sounds like this. How did Donald Trump manage to save face using populism after so many goofs that he has made on Twitter?
I think this is a brilliant question. I mean, all of them are, but this makes me laugh, because if I had the answer to this, I would probably be an influencer and not a professor anymore, because I wouldn't need to, although I enjoy my work. But not to be flippant, just to sort of try to address your question. I actually think that that part of the sort of appeal that populist candidates have to their voters lies in the fact that they're very charismatic. And that charisma comes from particularly the way that they communicate, the way they carry themselves, right? Even the fact that we spend an inordinate amount of time talking about his hair, or about Boris Johnson's hair for that matter, and he's also been characterized as sort of populist by some scholars, is something that has to do with the sort of image, but the way they project themselves, the sort of way they communicate, the way the kind of the perception they create of their own public persona. So they're goofy. That means that they're like the people, right? Like just like your everyday kind of next door neighbor kind of politician, even though clearly, obviously, they're not. He's part of the elite himself, of the financial elite, as we know very well. Bernie Sanders sort of detailed that in his campaign profusely, but also he's as far from the common people as you can get, but he speaks like the common people. He sort of wants to be perceived as such to make himself more relatable and more kind of, more believable, I think, more trustworthy as well. And that's part of why he's considered charismatic. And the goofs just make him like all of us, right? And yeah, no matter how construed they might be and how sort of strategically used they may be. Thank you.
Does anyone have a comment? If not, you don't have a question.
I do have another question.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
I was wondering, does populism, can populism be learned or is it something that you have to have deeply, maybe you develop it unconsciously, or can you actually do training to use it very efficiently?
So that is really interesting. I wonder if I could ever actually teach that to somebody now that I know how it works in terms of discourse. I have to be honest with you. We also got some of the one of the reviewers for our article comment on this. How do we know that Trump didn't actually believe this, right? That it's just strategic cues. Actually, I almost think that, well, it doesn't matter whether or not he believed it, right? Because it just worked as a strategy. I do think it can be learned. Yeah. But I do think that it depends from leader to leader. I think that it's somebody like Trump actually believes in the ideas that he sort of promotes, but also the persona has I don't think he was born a populist, right? But he sort of built an image of himself strategically, and as a politician, being the outsider, right? The one who's not the political elite. He's the one that's kind of coming from outside Washington, D.C. to clean the swamp, to drain the swamp, right? Of liberal politicians in D.C. So I do think that is very much learned and strategically used language for a very clear political purpose. But I mean, do I think that his goofiness might be his own personality trait? Possibly, right? Is he strategic enough to know and to have a whole sort of campaign staff telling him to use that to his advantage electorally? Yes. So yeah, I think it's I think it's mostly strategic and mostly learned, strategically used for sure.
Thank you.
Of course, thank you.
So if you have more questions, please ask them now. If not, then we'll take our leave from our wonderful speaker today. So any more questions, any more comments? Now is the time to ask. Okay, so we have one more from Marinela Sorina Vadova, who's asking, did Donald Trump made the good choice during the pandemic? I mean, the laws that he has given.
Okay, this is going a bit, so thank you for the question. Excuse me, this is going a bit, it's going a bit beyond the sort of scope of our research, because we're not analyzing policy, we're just analyzing the discourse, the public discourse. So I wouldn't be able to give you, you know, a fair sort of scientific answer based on research, right? Probably have to look at public opinion data to see what the public believes. You would probably, you know, if you were to speak with most kind of public health specialists in the US and global health specialists around the world, they would basically largely disagree with the kind of management strategy that he took. It wasn't very effective. We know that, you know, the sort of his crisis management led, or mismanagement in the beginning particularly, led to large numbers of deaths and cases, and sort of the spread of COVID very, very rapidly during the months that he was in power. And that also, I think, led to partly explains the success that Joe Biden had running on a campaign of sort of vaccinating people very quickly, and of introducing sort of more restrictions and sort of mask wearing. So yeah, I think that's as far as I can kind of go. I think otherwise it would be speculation from a scientific point of view. I wouldn't be sort of truthful to data out there on his policies, crisis management policies. But thank you very much for the question.
I hope you're happy with the answer. You know, the person who asked or commented. So yes, she says nicely, very nicely. Thank you.
Thank you.
We thank you too, Marinella, for your question. Well, if no one has any more questions, then please allow me to thank you very much. You know, our deepest thanks go to Dr. Lacatus for being here and, you know, enlightening all of us with how to best correlate her findings with our own, you know, contemporary experience. And go ahead and use the same type of analysis, you know, if we find it, you know, telling and, you know, intriguing, to contact her and say, well, we're going to cite your research, because that's one way, you know, in this country, at least, to avoid plagiarism and so on. So we know what kind of, you know, kind of academic environment we live in. So people are saying in the chat box, they're thanking you, Dr. Lacatus, for your talk today. We're very, very happy, and we're very thankful, because we know you give us from your generous time, and you agreed to talk at the Romanian American University to the students and to the audience today. Thank you very much, and we hope you know, you had a good experience with us. We welcome you back anytime. I thank the audience for their questions. I think we had a very nice Q&A at the end, and we appreciate your work. We appreciate you, and we want you to come in person on campus at
hopefully soon. Thank you very much, Simona. Thank you, Christy, for your help. It's been a pleasure. Thank you also for the questions. They've been brilliant, and I'm very happy if you want to follow up questions via email. I'm happy to address them. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to share my research. I hope that you found it enjoyable, and I hope that you're all managing to stay healthy and relatively sane, given the madness around us. Hopefully see you in person sometime soon. Bye. Thank you very much again. Bye.
We would love to have you on campus anytime and meet the students, you know, in person.
That'd be a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All of you, please, all of us, stay safe and healthy and happy if possible. Okay. Thank you all for coming here today and joining us for the talk. And come, you know, and visit us again for all the talks at the American Studies Center at the Romanian American University. We will be bringing you more talks, you know, along the way. Each month we will have another talk in this talk series. Thank you very much to the speaker, to the audience, and let's hope we see each other in healthy and peaceful times. Okay.